organization known as the KLA.
The German Secret Service played a very important role later in supporting the terrorist groups in Serbia.
German BND operatives trained KLA troops, picked their officers, and provided them with an arsenal of ammunition. In April of 1996, the KLA announced itself to the world through a series of assassinations of civilians and police in Kosovo.
Inside Kosovo, they clearly represented a modest-sized minority. I would estimate no more than 15 to 20% of the Kosovo Albanians supported the KLA. But they have international roots in Europe and America as well as in Albania, and over the years had developed funding, gathered arms, and they were not necessarily just attacking Serb police. They were killing civilian Albanians who did not support independence. They may have supported the government, or they may have supported Mr. Rugova's pacifist faction. They also were terrorizing the other ethnic minorities of Kosovo, the Gypsies, the Turks, the Gorani, Slavic Muslims, and others. They did this before the war, during the NATO air war, and they've been doing it again since the air war, nonstop.
After 2 years of terrorist incidents, the KLA was able to draw an armed response from the Milosevic government against KLA strongholds. As in the previous Yugoslav conflicts, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights would later report that human rights abuses were widespread on all sides, but both the media coverage and U.S. government spokespersons focused their criticism on the Milosevic government.
It is clear that no matter who was in government, the nature of this terrorist war conducted by the KLA was guaranteed to generate a strong police reaction.
Ruder Finn, which had profited handsomely by its wartime experience with Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, was chosen to handle public relations for the Kosovo Albanians. By the middle of 1998, as NATO approached its 50th anniversary without a clear direction or adversary, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was reported to be eager for a confrontation with Milosevic. She pressed President Clinton to bomb the Serbs.
So many of these decisions are driven by personalities and by the power struggles that go on within bureaucracies. Madeleine Albright, who obviously is the first woman Secretary of State, sees herself in a role where she has to be remembered as being tough.
As Madeleine Albright has said, if you've got all the military power, why not use it? If you can bomb and force people to do what you want them to do, why spend months of delicate diplomatic negotiation?
Instead, President Clinton sent Richard Holbrooke to meet with Slobodan Milosevic and leaders of the KLA, whom U.S. envoy Robert Gelbard had described as terrorists only a year previously. Under a demilitarization agreement, the OSCE, or Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, was assigned to monitor the agreement.
The Serbian army did pull back to their barracks, that there was a de-escalation in the fighting, and there was a rather low-intensity struggle going on there. There was still some outbursts of fighting, primarily instigated by the KLA, but generally speaking, that the OSCE monitors did have a settling effect in Kosovo.
We had the opportunity, imperfect as it was, to work and to monitor and to seek a rational, logical, civil solution to the problems and the grievances within Kosovo. Kosovo was a political problem that could not be solved by NATO bombers bombing from 23,000 feet. This had to be solved through negotiations and diplomacy.
The head of the Kosovo OSCE verification mission, William Walker, was a controversial hardline U.S. diplomat who had been criticized for his cozy relationship with the military government in El Salvador, where he served as ambassador. In Kosovo, his portrayal of a bloody battle at Račak as a massacre became the justification of the NATO bombing campaign against Yugoslavia.
If you remember Račak just a few weeks ago, where there were massacres, dozens of people with their throats slit, it has been a systematic expansion of this whole atrocities.
We've seen innocent people taken from their homes, forced to kneel in the dirt and sprayed with bullets. Kosovar men dragged from their families, fathers and sons together, lined up, and shot in cold blood.
Autopsies by 3 different internationally recognized forensic pathologists told a very different story. None of the victims, who were overwhelmingly men of fighting age, had had their throats slit. None were mutilated. Instead of execution-style killings, the men were shot from different angles. The Italian newspaper Il Manifesto reported that autopsies confirmed the presence of gunpowder on the hands of 37 men, a strong indication that the dead were soldiers killed in a battle, who were later dragged to the site by the KLA, which had contacted Walker.
Reporters from Le Monde and from Le Figaro were invited by the Yugoslav army to go into Račak. They did the morning before the massacre took place, or supposedly took place. There was no one in the village. It was a known KLA village. It had been the subject of Yugoslav army attacks before. When they went in the morning, there was only one or two very elderly Albanians in the village. But as they approached the middle of the village, the Yugoslav army units became under fire from the hills above. All that day there was a fierce firefight in the hills. And in the evening, the Yugoslav army pulled out with the two reporters from Le Figaro and Le Monde. The following day, the OSCE with General Walker were invited back to the village and were shown a trench with 45 bodies in it. Now the reporters on the scene said that there was no bloodshed around the trench. There were very few empty shell cases. They became immediately suspicious that this was a setup, that what was in the trench were bodies of the Albanian casualties of the fighting the day before, and they have reported it as such. But General Walker immediately went back and announced to the world that there had been a frightful massacre of Albanians.
Ironically, William Walker, who had been accused in the past of covering up massacres by the El Salvador government, was now suspected of transforming the story of a bloody gun battle into a civilian massacre at a crucial time for U.S. and NATO policies in the region.
Well, it's very important because I think everybody pretty well agrees that without the Račak massacre, there would have been no bombing of Yugoslavia.
The press coverage of the Račak incident strengthened the Clinton administration hardliners. Under the threat of bombing, the Serbs were now pressed by Secretary Albright to sign a document drafted by the State Department. This document, known as the Rambouillet Accords, would place NATO troops in Kosovo and effectively permit the Albanian majority to separate from Serbia through a referendum within 3 years. State Department insiders acknowledged later the Rambouillet Accords were drafted in a way that they expected the Serbs to reject. Publicly, we were seeking an agreement, said State Department Secretary James Rubin, but privately we knew the chances of the Serbs agreeing were quite small. To ensure that Serbs would reject the pact and to pave the way for NATO bombing, a new demand, Appendix B, was added by the United States, which gave NATO, quote, free, unrestricted passage, unimpeded access throughout the whole of Yugoslavia, including associated airspace and territorial waters. In other words, an open-ended occupation of the entire Yugoslavia.
If we look at the documentation and the ultimatums presented, we know that this was a disingenuous exercise in blunt, brute power. It was never a realistic proposal for peace.
There were never accords, they were a diktat to which the Yugoslav government nor any other sovereign state could ever agree.
The threat of force in negotiations, known as gunboat diplomacy, has been used in the past by major powers, including Nazi Germany, but legal experts observe that it was explicitly outlawed by the UN Charter following World War II.
The integrity of a sovereign state is not subject to attack by any other country that doesn't like it. You can't threaten it, you can't attack it. The launching of that kind of attack is aggressive war.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo. We have acted with resolve. By acting now, we are upholding our values, protecting our interests, and advancing the cause of peace.
When the bombing started, I left. I decided that was it. I was getting out. I went back to Washington. I wrote a farewell message to colleagues in OHR saying that this was, if ever they wanted to unify the Serbs in support of Milosevic, they had just done it.
By that time, the Yugoslav military prepared itself by deploying its troops in the field, hiding its major supplies, and preparing for a long air campaign, which had been part of their doctrine going back to Tito's falling out with Stalin. This was what they were prepared for, and this is why Yugoslavia, a small a country as it is, could stand up to this concerted aerial onslaught for 79 days.
I'm not sure NATO really had a strategy. I think that they had been led to believe that after 2 or 3 days of bombing, Milosevic would have caved in, which indicates pretty clearly to me they don't know very much about Serbian history.